Hello. It doesn't work. So I'll try to shout. Yeah. I spent a lot of time trying to set everything here, but anyhow, it doesn't work. So again, I repeat, this will be the last lecture in this block, and it is the lecture that is included in the midterm exam, second midterm. The lectures on Wednesday and Friday are not included in the midterm exam. So the endocrine system, part one, just to remind you that last time we were concentrating mainly on the master endocrine gland in the body, which is the part of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, or the hypophysis cerebri. And we found that there are a lot of hormones or releasing hormones that are secreted from the pituitary gland. These hormones affect the function of other glands in the body that we are going to study today. So one of the glands that we are going to study today is the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland, as you can see here, can you hear me well? Okay. So the thyroid gland, as you can see here, is located in the neck. It is, in fact, it's in the lower part of the neck. You don't expect it to be in the upper part. It's in the lower part of the neck, and it's below the thyroid cartilage. This is part of the larynx we are going to study on Wednesday, and this is called the thyroid cartilage, or they call it Adam's apple. It is the part that goes up and down during swallowing. It looks like a shield. So a shield is the thyros, so it's called the thyroid cartilage, and the gland is called the thyroid gland because it is closely related to the thyroid cartilage, which looks like a shield. However, the gland itself looks like a butterfly. It has two lobes. The lobes are pear-shaped, and the lobes are connected together in the midline by a narrow part of the gland, which is called the isthmus. And this part of the gland, the isthmus, is located in front of the trachea, in front of the upper part of the trachea. So two lobes connected by an isthmus, and the gland is located in the lower part of the neck in close relation to the thyroid cartilage. This gland, inside the gland, as you can see here, that there are follicles and follicular cells. This is a microscopic view, a light microscopic view. You can see a group of cells here. We have mentioned these cells, follicular cells, before when we dealt with the type of epithelium. So this is a typical simple cuboidal epithelium. These follicular cells, a follicle is like a sac of cells that contains fluid inside. And so it has a fluid inside, which is called the thyroglobulin, which is the precursor of the thyroid hormone, and is located in this space. And these are the follicular cells that secrete the thyroid hormone. So the thyroglobulin, this is an unusual thing about a gland, in that the material that is produced by the cells is stored outside the cell. So it's stored here, but this is not the active form of the enzyme. Whenever not the active form of the hormone. Whenever the hormone is needed, then it will be uptaken by the cells and activated and then released to the blood, because it's an endocrine gland, so it releases the hormone to the blood. The hormones, there are two hormones here. Both of them are called thyroid hormones. There is T3 and T4, triiodothyronine, T3, and tetraiodothyronine, indicates the number of iodine molecules that are contained in this hormone. That's why iodine is important for the function of the gland, because the hormone contains iodine. This thyroid hormone, it regulates the oxygen use and the metabolic rate, and it also regulates the cellular metabolism. So it increases, it regulates it and increases the cellular metabolism, and is also responsible partly for growth and development. So it increases actually the oxygen use of the cell. It has an effect on on glucose and lipids, so it causes catabolism of both, and this will result in with the production of ATP. Here again, you can see that the follicle, the multiple follicles are present in the thyroid gland. It's a sac filled with fluid, which is a colloid material. It's the precursor of the enzyme. And the follicular cells, which are simple cuboidal epithelial cells, they surround it. You can see the close proximity of the follicles to blood vessels. There are a lot of blood vessels here because this is an endocrine gland and requires that the blood vessels be very close to it so that it secretes into the blood vessels. There is no duct. Ducts are present in exocrine glands. So in addition to these thyroid follicles and follicular cells that produce the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, there are other cells which are located either in between the follicular or in between the follicles themselves. Like these are circles, the follicles, but in between them there are other cells, either present as singles or clusters, and so they are called parafollicular cells. And these parafollicular cells, they have a totally different function from the follicular cells. They are again endocrine cells, but they secrete another hormone, which is called calcitonin. That's why these parafollicular cells sometimes are called C cells, because indicating that they secrete calcitonin. And calcitonin has nothing to do with the functions of the thyroid hormones that are produced by the follicular cells. So it is as if it is two glands in one. There are the main type of cells are the follicular cells, but there are other cells which are called parafollicular cells, or the C cells that produce the calcitonin. And the calcitonin, as its name might indicate, it affects the amount of calcium which is circulating in the blood. So it reduces the decreases the level of calcium in the blood. It has exactly the opposite effect of another hormone which is secreted by the parathyroid glands, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So it reduces the level of calcium in the blood, and this is done by reducing the activity of osteoclasts. Remember the cells in the bone, there are osteoclasts that destroy bone tissue, and the osteoclasts are always working in balance with osteoblasts. Remember osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. So these cells the osteoclasts resorb the bone, destroy the bone, and therefore when the bone is destroyed, then the calcium will be released to the blood. So this calcitonin reduces the function of osteoclasts. So the calcium is preserved in the bone, and at the same time it increases the excretion of calcium by the kidneys. It's opposite situation to the parathyroid hormone. I'm going to talk about the parathyroid hormone now. So before going to the parathyroid, again, the thyroid gland is located in the neck. It has multiple follicles. You can see the follicle here, and in between these follicles, as you can see here, there are parafollicular cells. The follicles, which are the main cells here that secrete the thyroid hormones, two thyroid hormones containing molecules of iodine, and the parafollicular cells, they secrete the calcitonin, a totally different hormone in action from the thyroid hormone. The parathyroid glands, as you can see them here, the green ones, 1, 2, 3, and 4, they are very small glands, pea-sized glands, and they are located posterior to the thyroid gland, in very close proximity to the thyroid. And they are sometimes embedded within the thyroid gland. So sometimes, actually during thyroid surgery, because it is so closely related to the thyroid gland, because they are very small and difficult to identify, so sometimes as a complication of thyroid surgery, the parathyroid glands might be removed, and the patient will require the additional hormones because the glands are removed. They are 4 in shape, and as I said, they are closely related to the posterior part of the thyroid gland. this, as you can see here, in this is a diagram showing microscopic appearance of the parathyroid gland. This is the parathyroid gland, and here you can see the follicles of the thyroid. So it's very closely related to the thyroid gland. This is the thyroid, and this is the parathyroid gland. The parathyroid gland has, most of the cells are called the chief cells. So these are the chief cells, or the principal cells. They secrete the parathyroid hormone. Again, you can see that there are a lot of blood vessels related to the chief cells. And there are other cells, which are acidophilic cells called oxyphil cells. The function of these cells is not clear, but at least they do not produce the hormone. The hormone is produced by these cells, by the chief cells, the parathyroid hormone, and then it gains access to the blood and the blood vessels that are located nearby. So two types of cells, one hormone, okay? In the parathyroid gland, two types of cells, two hormones. The parathyroid hormone, it raises the blood calcium. So it's the opposite of the calcitonin of the thyroid gland, of the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. How does it increase calcium level in the blood? It will act on the bone, on the osteoclasts, and will increase the activity of osteoclasts. So there will be bone resorption, and this will mobilize the calcium from the bone to the blood. The second, it acts on the kidney and increases the reabsorption of calcium from the kidney. We're going to study the urinary system in block 3, and you will find that in the kidney, the blood is filtered in the kidney. And most of what is filtered, probably 90% of what is filtered in the kidney, is going to be reabsorbed again. So the blood is filtered, calcium is filtered, and then reabsorbed again from the kidney in another part of the nephron, which we are going to talk about later on. So this is what is meant by increasing reabsorption of calcium. Calcium is going to be filtered, but the hormone increases its reabsorption back to the blood, so it will not be lost. But in case of the calcitonin, it doesn't increase its reabsorption, so it's going to be excreted with the urine. But here, the calcium returns back, reabsorbed back from the urine to the blood, and also the parathyroid hormone, it promotes the formation of vitamin D, which is produced in its active form. It's produced in the kidney and in the liver, and this vitamin D increases the absorption of calcium from the intestine. So that's how it also contributes to increasing the calcium level in the blood. Destroys bone, so it mobilizes the calcium to the blood, increases reabsorption from the kidney, and increases absorption from the gastrointestinal tract by acting on, or by activating the vitamin D. So it's actually its opposite function of calcitonin. The other gland is the adrenal gland. By the way, the thyroid gland is controlled by the pituitary gland, by the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is secreted by the anterior pituitary, but there's no control from the pituitary over the parathyroid gland. The adrenal glands are also partly controlled by the pituitary gland, by the production of adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, from the anterior pituitary gland. The adrenal gland, as you can see, there are two glands. They are closely related to the upper pole of the kidney, and that's the origin of the name, adrenal. So ad means close, opposite to ab. Ab means away. So adrenal, close to the renal gland. That's the origin of the name, because close to the renal, close to the kidney. Renal is the kidney, so adrenal gland. So two glands closely related to the upper pole of the kidney. You can see that they have a good blood supply, a lot of blood vessels supplying them, and this can be understood because, again, it is an endocrine gland. In fact, this gland, the adrenal gland, is two glands in one. So there is a cortex, as you can see here, the cortex and the pinkish part, and then in the center there is the medulla. So there's adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. The epinephrine and norepinephrine, we have heard of these substances as neurotransmitters. Collectively they are called catecholamines, and we have mentioned that with the autonomic nervous system. So in fact, the adrenal medulla is part of the autonomic nervous system. But it does, when it releases the epinephrine and norepinephrine, it releases them to the blood. It doesn't release them to an effector organ, like what happens, for example, remember the autonomic nervous system? We mentioned that the neurotransmitters are released closer to a smooth muscle fiber, for example, or close to a gland, like sweaty gland, for example. But here, these neurotransmitters are secreted into the blood from the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex is most of the gland. Here's the adrenal cortex. So that's the suprarenal or adrenal cortex. It is in 3 layers, as you can see. 3 parts. Each part has a different hormone and a different function. So 3 zones. The first zone is called zona glomerulosa. As the name indicates, glomerulosa, it forms like a tuft or a glomerulus of cells. The cells are gathered together like a glomerulus. So it's called zona glomerulosa. The other one is called zona fasciculata, and the cells are present parallel to each other, like fascicles. So that's why it's called fasciculata. And then the narrow part is called zona reticularis. The wider part is the zona fasciculata, and the reticularis is like a network, a reticular, a meshwork. The cells, they produce like a meshwork. That's the origin of the names. So zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. Each one of these zones has a different function and produces different hormone. So the hormone that is produced by the glomerulosa are called the mineralocorticoids, the aldosterone. The most important one is the aldosterone. And these are secreted in response to low blood pressure. So they will try to increase the blood pressure. The aldosterone increases the blood pressure by causing more reabsorption of sodium by the kidney. When the sodium is reabsorbed by the kidney, it will draw with it water. So water will not be lost in urine. It will return back to the blood. So this will increase the blood volume. By this way, it increases the blood volume. So this is the aldosterone. So it affects the salts in the body, mineralocorticoids. So that's why the name mineralo, because it affects the minerals, the salts. The second one, which is secreted by the zona fasciculata, is called the glucocorticoids. Again, a group of hormone. The most important one is called cortisol. And this is the one that is under the control of the anterior pituitary, adrenocorticotrophic hormone. It causes the release of cortisol. It's a glucocorticoid because it increases the level of glucose in the body. So how does it increase the level of glucose? It causes the destruction of glycogen, which is the form of carbohydrates that are stored in the liver, for example. So this is what we call glycogenolysis. It destroys the glycogen into glucose. It converts some non-carbohydrate material into carbohydrates, like fats or amino acids. The muscles, they convert them into, this is what we call gluconeogenesis. So in either way, it increases the level of blood glucose. So it acts on the sugars. And it has some anti-inflammatory effect. The other hormone, or hormones, are produced by the zona reticularis, and these are the androgens, or sex hormones. So the androgens, there are androgens in the females. In the male, most of the androgens, the testosterone is produced by the testes, but in the female, as well as in the male, some of the androgen is produced by the zona reticularis. So these 3 zones just to remind you. One of them affects the sugar, the salts, the mineralocorticoids, the aldosterone. The other affects the sugars, and the other affects the sex. So the three S's in the body are very closely related here. S for the salt, S for the sugar, and S for the sex. The three types of hormones that are secreted by the three zones of the adrenal cortex. The medulla, as I mentioned, the cells which are present in the medulla are called chromaffin cells, and they have the same embryological origin and almost the same function of the cells that are present in autonomic ganglia. But here, these cells, they produce the neurotransmitter into the blood, which is the norepinephrine and the epinephrine. By the way, norepinephrine and epinephrine, the other name of these hormones is adrenaline and noradrenaline, because adrenal, they are secreted by the adrenal cortex, and adrenal medulla. And again, the name epinephrine and norepinephrine, again, it's a reminder of the suprarenal gland. Epi means above, nephrin, nephros means kidney. So epinephrine, it is the hormone that is secreted by the gland that is located above the kidney. Okay? And these two hormones, they are, we call them sympathomimetic hormone. That's to say they produce effects that are similar to the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, like 2 lectures ago, we mentioned about the effect of the sympathetic nervous system, which prepares the body for fight or flight. So it increases the sugars in the blood. It causes contraction of some smooth muscle fibers, like contraction of smooth muscle fibers in the skin or in the blood vessels of the skin as well. Or it causes dilatation of the coronary arteries that supply the heart or the muscles. Also, it causes dilated pupil. So all these functions are produced by these hormones circulating in the blood or directly affecting the effector organ. And if you remember that it was mentioned that this autonomic overflow, sympathetic overflow, will take longer time to resolve because there are hormones circulating in the blood as well as the neurotransmitters that are secreted locally. An overproduction of glucocorticoids, of cortisol, will result in what we call Cushing syndrome. Sometimes the Cushing disease is because of a tumor in the pituitary, so it increases ACTH, and ACTH increases the glucocorticoids or cortisol, or sometimes it's a tumor in the suprarenal gland itself, or maybe a tumor somewhere else in the body, and there are some tumors that secrete hormones. So like some of the tumors, especially tumors of the lung, might secrete hormones, including ACTH, that causes this syndrome, Cushing syndrome, which, as you can see here, there is characterized by moon-shaped face. There is a hump on the back because the fats will be destroyed and will be reorganized, so there will be more fat on the back, on the upper back. They call it buffalo hump. And there will be, the muscles also will be destroyed. So the muscles will become very thin, as you can see here, very thin muscles. There is a central obesity, weakness and pendulousness of the abdomen. So I don't want to go into details, but Cushing syndrome is a result of oversecretion of aldosterone from the cortex of the suprarenal gland. The other gland here is the pancreas. We are going to study the pancreas now, and we are going to study it again when we deal with the gastrointestinal tract. For the simple reason is that the pancreas is a double gland. It's an exocrine and endocrine gland. So 2 glands in one. One of them is exocrine and the other is endocrine. Like the thyroid, it has two cells secrete two hormones, but both of them are endocrine. Suprarenal, cortex and medulla, both of them are endocrine. But this gland is partly endocrine, partly exocrine. So this is the shape of the pancreas. It is located in the upper part of the abdomen. Here's the duodenum, and the duodenum, as we will study later on, it is C-shaped. So the head of the pancreas, because the pancreas has a head, body, and tail. So the head of the pancreas lies in the C shape of the duodenum, and then we have the body and the tail of the pancreas. And it is located in the posterior part of the abdomen. It is plastered to the posterior abdominal wall. And this is what we see when we have a section in the pancreas. So you will find that 90% of the section of the pancreas is formed of acini. These acini, they are part of the exocrine pancreas. 90% a C of these acinar cells that secrete hormones which go to the gastrointestinal tract, but in between the C of these cells there are islands. So these islets are called the islets of Langerhans. The islets of Langerhans, after the name of the person who first mentioned them. So these are the islands. They look lighter stained, and they contain a group of cells. These cells, they secrete multiple hormones, and these hormones, they will gain access to the blood. So they are endocrine glands. So this is the endocrine part of the pancreas, which constitutes about 10% of the size of the pancreas, but most of the pancreas is exocrine part of the pancreas that secretes digestive enzymes. We are going to deal with these enzymes later on. You can see here, this is a dissection of the pancreas, and you can see when the pancreas is dissected, you can see that there is a duct, a very long duct. And of course, there are multiple ducts opening into it, smaller ducts, and then the main pancreatic duct. And the main pancreatic duct opens into the duodenum so that it will, because these are digestive enzymes that are produced by this gland. But, and here you can see these are the acini, the group of cells that like they are like grapes, and they surround a lumen here, and these lumina they will connect together and form ducts. Of course, smaller duct, larger, and then becomes the main duct. So this is the exocrine part of the pancreas. This is the a diagram showing it. So here, this represents the whole area here, and then you have the endocrine part of the pancreas. This is the islets of Langerhans. They contain, in fact, 4 types of cells. It's very difficult to differentiate between them, or it's impossible to differentiate between them in light microscopy. There are special techniques to identify these cells. So we have 4 types of cells here, and they produce different hormones. But the main cell are the beta cells that they produce the insulin. The other cells are alpha cells, which produce the glucagon. Glucagon and insulin have reverse functions. So the glucagon increases blood sugar levels, while insulin decreases blood sugar levels. Delta cells are very small amount of cells here, 5%, and they produce a hormone which is called somatostatin, and this will act on both alpha and beta cells, depressing their function. And then the last type of cell is F cells, and these F cells, they produce a hormone that acts locally. It doesn't go far away. It acts locally on the pancreas and inhibit the activity of the exocrine part of the pancreas. So alpha cells and beta cells are the main cells that will control the blood sugars in the body. The beta cells secrete insulin, which reduces the blood sugar in the blood, and alpha cells will produce glucagon, which increases the blood sugar level of blood sugar in the body. In diabetes mellitus, the insulin is there's a problem in the insulin. So there is increased amount of blood sugar, because insulin reduces the level of blood sugar. How does insulin reduce the level of blood sugar? I would like to remind you of the first or probably the second lecture we had when we dealt with the cell membrane and the proteins that are present and that act as transporter proteins through the cell membrane. And we said that these proteins, they will allow the sugar to pass by a mode of facilitated diffusion of sugar. So when the insulin will attach to a cell, the insulin which is secreted by the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans, when it attaches to a receptor on a cell membrane, it will induce that cell to produce more of these proteins that will act as channels for glucose to pass into the cell. So more glucose will pass into the cell, and there, of course, this glucose is circulating in the blood, so the amount of blood sugar will be reduced. Okay? So what happens in diabetes, it's either, like there are two types of diabetes. I'm not going to go into details because this is not as part of our objective, but probably, definitely you have heard of diabetes before. It's a very common disease, and there are two types of diabetes. One of them is called type 1, which affects young people, and this is an autoimmune disease, and this is because of the fact that there are the beta cells are destroyed, so there is no insulin. There's no insulin at all. That's why the patient has to have to inject insulin, because there is no insulin produced. But in the second type of diabetes, diabetes type 2, insulin is there, but it is not acting very well because of down-regulation, reduced amount of receptors of insulin. So it's all about insulin in case of diabetes mellitus. And insulin is secreted by the major cells which are present in the islets of Langerhans, and these are the beta cells. 70% are beta cells. The other glands, which again we are going to visit again in much more detail when we deal with the reproductive system in block 3. These are the ovaries and testes. And these are, together they are called gonads. Okay? So that's why we have the gonadotrophins, which are they are under control of gonadotrophins, which are secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. So the ovaries, they secrete estrogen, progesterone, relaxin, and inhibin. Of course, estrogen and progesterone are secreted by under the effect of follicular stimulating hormone. Just to remind you, there's follicular stimulating and luteinizing hormones produced by the anterior pituitary, and inhibin will inhibit the secretion of follicular stimulating hormone. Relaxin is usually secreted during pregnancy and causes some relaxation of joints, particularly the pubic symphysis, and so it will allow for easier labor. We are going to study more details later on, so don't worry about that. So these hormones, they regulate the reproductive cycle. Again, we are going to deal with the reproductive cycle, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle when we deal with the reproductive system. They maintain pregnancy and female secondary sexual characteristics, and they prepare the mammary glands for lactation. The testis has, inside the testis, there are interstitial cells, which are called Leydig cells. They produce testosterone under the effect of luteinizing hormone. This was mentioned earlier. Again, I'm not going to show you the histology here, because we're going to study the histology later on when we study the reproductive system. So the testis secretes, it produces the sperms, but at the same time, it is a gland. There are cells which are interstitial cells present between the seminiferous tubules. These cells, they produce the testosterone under the effect of the luteinizing hormone. The other gland here is called the pineal gland. So it's a very small gland located in the brain and at the roof of the third ventricle. Here's the region of the third ventricle between the two thalami, the third ventricle, and connected to the roof of the third ventricle is the pineal gland. As the name indicates, it looks like the pine nuts, so that's why it's called the pineal gland. Might look like the nut, or it looks like the what's they call it, the seed of the pine trees, but most likely it looks like the nut, so that's why they call it the pineal gland. And it contains cells which are called pinealocytes, and of course neuroglia, because this is nervous tissue. So the neuroglia are the connective, the cells or the connective tissue cells of the nervous system. But the cells that secrete the hormone are called pinealocytes. And the hormone secreted is called melatonin. Not melanin, but melatonin, okay? And the reason for that, melatonin has no relation to melanin, but when it was first discovered, it was discovered in a kind of fish, and it was noted that this hormone in the fish changes the color of the skin. So that's why it was thought that it is something related to melanin, so that's why it was called melatonin. But it is not related to melanin whatsoever. It is related to setting the biological clock. So this gland is important for setting the biological clock in the body. The gland is sensitive to the light day or light dark cycle, and the activity of the gland is affected by the light dark cycle. So melatonin secretion produces sleepiness, and that's why sometimes it is used for people who suffer from insomnia, inability to sleep. So melatonin secretion as a synthetic form, of melatonin. So melatonin secretion produces sleepiness, and the secretion of melatonin is induced by darkness. Whenever there is darkness, then it will be secreted. Whenever there is light, so the retina will be sensitive to the light. Some impulses from the retina will reach the hypothalamus, and from the hypothalamus, fibers will reach a sympathetic trunk, which is present in the neck. It's a kind of, an unusual connection. Still, the function of the pineal gland is not clear, and its connection is so unusual. As you can see here, it's so complicated. Fibers from the retina, instead of going to the cortex, and the cerebral cortex for vision, these fibers will go to the hypothalamus, and from the hypothalamus they go down into the neck to a ganglion, superior cervical ganglion of the sympathetic trunk, and then fibers will ascend back to the pineal gland. So when there is light, then the norepinephrine will inhibit the secretion of melatonin by the pineal gland, and so that the person will not go into sleep. In dark situations, the melatonin will be secreted and will induce more sleep. And that's why it not only affects the sleep, but affects the mood. So that's why some people in winter, and winter's coming, or it's starting actually now, the people might have depression in winter time because of excessive extra secretion of melatonin, because there's longer dark periods. So the darkness increases the secretion of melatonin. And for the treatment of that is the exposure for several hours per day to sunlight. This will reduce what we call seasonal affective disorder, SAD. And also exposure for several hours will relieve the jet lag. That's the tension or inability to sleep that will be suffered by people who travel rapidly over multiple time zones, resulting in what we call jet lag. So they need to be well exposed to sunlight in order to recover from this jet lag. This is just an extra slide to show you that the pineal gland function in human is not very clear. Its function in some animals is very well understood and reasonable because it controls the hibernation in seasonal animals. The hormone has an antigonadotropic effect. So when it is secreted during the winter time because of longer dark hours, then this will reduce the gonadotropic hormones, and the animals will not reproduce. But when spring comes and there is longer light hours, then this will be perceived and result in the reduction of melatonin secretion, and so the animals will start breeding. That's the breeding season. This effect has not been observed in humans, but it is well observed that there is a rhythm in the production of melatonin in animals. You are not required to know about this, but I'm just mentioning it to give you an idea that the function of the pineal gland is not very well understood in humans. What we understand that it affects the sleep rhythm and the biological clock, but in animals it has other functions, like as I mentioned in fish, it changes the color of the skin. In seasonal animals, it affects the breeding and has an antigonadotropic effect. Yet in some other animals here, like in reptiles, they have a third eye, especially for the pineal gland. So as you can see here, that there is a small lens here, and this lens in the head, in the top of the head, called parietal eye, and this is just for sensing light. It doesn't, the animal will not be able to see with this sense, but just to allow the light to pass, and here it can directly affect the pineal gland and control the rhythm of the pineal. The last gland, again, which I'm going to mention only few points about it, because we are going to study this gland when we deal with the lymphatic system, because it is part of the lymphatic system of the body, is the thymus gland. And the thymus gland has an important role in maturation of certain types of lymphocytes, which are called T cells, T lymphocytes. T referring to the thymus, because these cells, they mature in the thymus because of the hormones that are produced by the thymus gland. These are the hormones. So they have local effects. These hormones, they have local effects and inside the thymus, and they cause the maturation of lymphocytes, which are produced in the bone marrow, special type of lymphocytes called T lymphocytes. When we are going to study the immune system, we will find that there are two types of lymphocytes, T cells and B cells. Both of them are produced in the bone marrow, but the B cells are produced and mature in the bone marrow. The T cells are produced, but they mature in the thymus under the effect of the hormones that are produced by the thymus. And as you can see, that the thymus is located inside the thorax, in the part which is called the mediastinum, in the middle of the thorax. It's not in the neck like the thyroid. The thyroid is located in the neck. This is the thymus, which is located in the superior mediastinum in the thorax. More details will be given about the histology and the function of the thymus when we study the lymphatic system in block 3. Questions? Yes.